On a cold, rain-swept evening, when every last employee had filtered out of the glass tower and the city below had dissolved into streaks of headlights, the CEO stood alone at the floor-to-ceiling window and said it barely above a whisper, barely meant for anyone. Men never stay. The only person still in the building was a maintenance technician who had come to fix the electrical panel on the top floor. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't argue. He looked at her for one quiet second and then he said something that stopped her cold. No one could have known that those few words would unravel every version of the past she had spent years constructing and redirect the futures of two people who had no business being in each other's lives. Christopher Hale moved through the world the way certain men do quietly, and with the particular economy of someone who has learned that most things don't require comment. He was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of work rather than vanity, with hands that were always slightly rough and a face that gave nothing away unless you knew where to look. He had been an engineer once, not a contractor, not a repairman, but the kind of engineer whose name appeared on the structural certifications of buildings that housed hundreds of people. He had been good at it. Better than good. His colleagues had called him the one who caught things no one else caught, the one who could walk into a system 3 weeks before failure and identify the exact pressure point that would give way. That was before the accident on the interstate in March, on a night when the roads were wet and the truck that crossed the center line was moving at a speed that left no room for outcomes other than the one that followed. Before 18 months of medical bills and the particular exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. Before the morning, he sat in the hospital corridor with a 6-year-old girl curled against his side and understood, with the clarity that sometimes arrives in the worst moments, that every plan he had made for his life would need to be rebuilt from a completely different foundation. He left engineering. Not bitterly, he was not a man given to bitterness, which required a certain amount of energy he had simply reallocated, but decisively. He took contract maintenance work instead, the kind that paid by the hour and made no demands on his time beyond the hours themselves. It let him be home by 6. It let him make dinner. It let him be the person who answered when his daughter, Lily, woke from bad dreams in the middle of the night and called down the hallway with a voice still half tangled in sleep. She was 6 years old now, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's habit of watching people carefully before deciding how much to trust them. She had taken it upon herself, sometime in the previous autumn, to pack his lunch most mornings, which meant he usually arrived at job sites with sandwiches that were slightly off-center and apple slices cut into shapes that were clearly intended to be stars. He ate every bite. He had learned not to comment on the shapes, because commenting made Lily explain the shapes at length, and the explanations were better than anything else about his mornings. He thought about her as he signed in at the security desk of Warden Tower on a Wednesday evening in mid-November. The building was a 40-story structure in the financial district, and the company that occupied the top 3 floors was Warden Consulting Group, one of those firms whose name appeared in enough business publications that even Christopher, who did not read business publications, had encountered it. The CEO was someone named Evelyn Ward. He had seen her photograph in the lobby directory, young, composed, with a quality in the set of her expression that suggested she had spent considerable effort arriving at a version of herself that required nothing from anyone else. He had noted this the way he noted most things as information, filed without judgment. He took the service elevator to the 38th floor and got to work. Evelyn Ward had not eaten since 7 that morning, and it was now nearly 9 at night. And she did not particularly care. She sat at her desk with 4 separate spreadsheets open across 2 monitors, a legal pad covered in her own tight handwriting on one side, and a cold cup of coffee she had forgotten on the other. She was 28 years old and had been running Warden Consulting for 14 months, having taken over after the previous CEO, a man 25 years her senior who had, in the board's measured phrasing, lost strategic alignment, had been asked to step aside. The board's decision had surprised the industry. It had not surprised Evelyn, who had watched the previous CEO's choices for 8 months and had been quietly preparing for exactly this eventuality without telling anyone. She had not thanked them. She had asked for the financials, reviewed them in a single weekend, and walked into her first Monday as CEO with a restructuring plan already drafted. People found her cold. She was aware of this. She found the observation neither troubling nor incorrect. What people called coldness, she experienced as a form of rigor, a commitment to function over performance, to outcomes over relationships. She had spent enough of her childhood watching relationships fail to have any remaining appetite for their theater. Her father had left when she was 9. Not dramatically, there had been no shouting. No final door slam that she could point to as the moment. He had simply been present and then, gradually, not present, until one afternoon she had realized she could not remember the last time she had seen him standing at the kitchen counter in the morning, or sitting in the chair by the window, with the newspaper he had never finished. Her mother had remarried twice after that. Both men were not cruel so much as absent in the way that some people are absent, even while standing in the same room occupying physical space without transferring warmth, saying the words associated with care without the nerve endings that made them mean anything. Evelyn had learned, before she was 12, that the reliable constant in any situation was her own capability, and that everything else was variable. She heard the elevator open at the end of the hall. The maintenance man. She had authorized the after-hours work order herself. The electrical fault on the east panel had been flagging for 2 weeks, and the facilities manager had promised it would be handled before Thursday's board presentation required the AV systems at full capacity. She turned back to her spreadsheets and forgot about him entirely. Christopher worked methodically. He had examined the fault report on the drive over and had already formed a theory about the source, a grounding issue that had probably originated in the junction box rather than the panel itself, which was where the facilities team had been looking. He opened his toolkit and began confirming. He noticed her through the glass partition as he passed the corridor. She was the only figure in the entire open-plan office, a single lamp burning at one desk in the dark, the city glowing 40 stories below her like a second, inverted sky. She didn't look up. He noticed something else. On her desk, amid the papers and the monitors, there was no food, no wrapper, no cup that had been used recently, nothing to suggest she had paused long enough to eat. He thought about Lily's lunchbox. He thought about the extra sandwich he always packed because Lily had determined several months ago that her father did not eat enough, a judgment she had delivered with great seriousness and had not revised since. He still had it in his bag. He set it on the edge of her desk without comment and returned to work. Evelyn stared at it for a moment. Then she looked toward the corridor. The maintenance man was already gone. The sound of his tools, a faint and distant percussion somewhere behind the access panels. "I don't need anyone to take care of me." She had not meant to say it out loud, but she had moved to the doorway of the service corridor, and the words came out with more edge than she intended, landing in the narrow space between them with a clarity that was almost embarrassing. Christopher didn't stop working. He was on his knees beside the open junction box, a flashlight held between his teeth, both hands occupied with a terminal connector. He glanced at her briefly, not with annoyance, not with apology, just the glance of a man noting information and filing it. "I know," he said. He went back to work. She stayed in the doorway. There was something disarming about the absence of a reaction, no wounded expression, no performance of helpfulness, no effort to justify the gesture. He had placed food on her desk the way he might have moved a tool out of a walkway, because it made sense to do it, not because it required acknowledgement. "How long will you be?" she asked. "Another hour, maybe 90 minutes. The problem wasn't in the panel." She frowned. "Our facilities team said it was the panel. Your facilities team was looking at the panel," Christopher said, without inflection. "The problem is in the junction box behind it. 3 corroded terminals. They'd have found it eventually." A pause. "Possibly after Thursday." She stared at him. He had said it without particular emphasis, not to embarrass anyone, not to demonstrate anything. Just a fact, offered plainly. She went back to her desk. She ate the sandwich. She didn't think about why. The storm arrived without much ceremony just before 10. The kind of November rain that falls sideways and turns the city into something abstract, all blurred light and sound. The building's older electrical systems began their complaints. A flicker along the corridor, a brief dropout in the server room's backup power that brought 3 different alarms online at once. Christopher was still on the 38th floor. He had solved the original problem an hour earlier and was preparing to leave when the storm-related faults began cascading through the panel. Leaving now would mean leaving them unresolved. He called ahead. His neighbor, Janet, who had a key and an understanding of the situation built over 2 years of quiet mutual reliability, would pick up Lily from aftercare. The elevators were down for safety protocol. The stairwell doors had gone to emergency lock. They ended up in the break room, because it had the only couch and the windows there were west-facing, away from the worst of the rain. Evelyn sat on one end with a glass of water. Christopher sat on the floor with his back against the cabinets, because he had been on his feet for 4 hours, and the floor was fine. The silence between them had a texture to it, the particular quality of silence between people who have no social obligation to fill it. The rain made the world outside the window entirely illegible. Inside, the light was the modest orange of emergency backup, everything a little warmer and a little dimmer than usual, and the ordinary distance between a CEO and a maintenance contractor seemed, in that light, to be less relevant than it had been. It was Evelyn who broke it. She broke it in the way people do when they have been alone with a thought for too long, and the weather outside has dissolved the usual rules about who is allowed to hear it. "Men never stay," she said. She was looking at the window. The rain moved across it like something trying to get in. I don't mean it as a generalization. I mean specifically. In my experience, every man I've known with any significance. My father, the people I've tried to, she stopped. They always leave. She wasn't speaking to him, not exactly. She was speaking to the room, to the rain, to the particular honesty that sometimes arrives when a person is exhausted enough to stop managing their own narrative. Christopher was quiet for a moment. "No," he said finally. "They stay. Just not where they're never seen." The room held it. Evelyn went very still. It was not a consolation. It was not an argument. It was a precise and quiet thing, like the identification of a fault in a system, not cruel, not gentle, simply accurate. And because it was accurate, it went through her like a current. She didn't ask him to explain it. She understood it immediately. And the understanding arrived not as a gradual awakening but as something close to impact, the kind of recognition that doesn't expand from a center outward, but arrives all at once, fully assembled, with the force of something that has been true for a very long time and has simply not been examined. She was 9 again, standing in the hallway of the house on Birchwood Avenue. Her father's car still in the driveway. The light on in the kitchen. He was still there, but she had already stopped looking by then, had already decided with the absolute certainty of a child who has decided that his leaving was simply a matter of time. So she had made herself unavailable to his presence before his absence was even a fact. She had moved through the house like a ghost of her own making, had answered his questions in single syllables, had accepted no comfort, had refused to be caught hoping. And then he had left. Which confirmed everything she already believed. Which felt like proof. Though she had been the one who had written the ending, she remembered other things then, arriving in sequence like items in an inventory she had never consented to take. Phone calls she had declined during university, her mother's voice on the message, saying that her father had called again, sounded tired, wanted to know how she was. A birthday card she had found in the mailbox in her second year, the handwriting she recognized before she opened it, which meant she had not opened it. Letters she had put in a drawer without reading, not from cruelty. From the particular self-protection of someone who has decided that the door is already closed, and that opening it again would cost more than it could possibly return. The clearest memory was this. He had knocked on her bedroom door one evening in early spring, the year before he left. She had been doing homework at her desk, or pretending to. He had stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, and said that he wanted to take her to the Science Museum on Saturday, just the two of them, the way they used to go when she was younger. She had not looked up from her textbook. She had said she had a project due. She did not have a project due. He had nodded, and said another time, then. He had meant it. She knew now, standing on the far side of 20 years, that he had meant it. But she had been so thoroughly armored by then, so certain the leaving was coming, that she had heard the offer as rehearsal for an apology he would eventually need. She had never examined this logic. It had simply been the architecture of her inner life, the framework everything else was built upon. Men never stay. She had believed it so thoroughly that she had never considered the possibility that she had, in some cases, made staying impossible. She sat with the water glass going warm in her hands, and felt something in her chest shift, not break, not mend, but move. Like a door opening onto a room she hadn't known was there. She began watching him after that. Not obviously, Evelyn was not a person who did things obviously, but with the complete and systematic attention she normally reserved for quarterly reports. He came on Tuesdays and Thursdays for the ongoing maintenance contract. He arrived at 7:30, and left at 4:15 without variation, regardless of what was or wasn't finished. She had asked facilities about it, not wanting to ask him directly. He picks up his daughter, the facilities manager had said, as if this were the most ordinary thing. Every day. Never misses it. She observed, over the following 2 weeks, that he did not stay late for anything. A senior VP had once tried to extend his hours on a Thursday because of an urgent server room issue, and Christopher had named 2 contractors who could handle it on short notice, handed over the relevant documentation with a thoroughness that suggested he had anticipated exactly this situation, and left at 4:15. He was not lazy. Every piece of work he completed was done with a precision the facilities team had come to rely on. With an almost embarrassing dependency, they had begun routing their more complex fault assessments to his work orders, rather than handling them in-house. He simply had a fixed point outside of the building that could not be moved, and he structured everything else around it. She thought about the men she had known, the ones who had stayed late every night and then left the relationships, the ones who had been endlessly present at work and entirely elsewhere at home, the ones who had used busyness as a form of avoidance that looked, from certain angles, like dedication. Christopher's absence at 4:15 every day was the most consistent form of presence she had ever witnessed. She found herself, one afternoon, standing at the window of her office as his truck turned out of the parking structure. She had not walked to the window with the intention of watching. She had been moving from one side of her desk to the other. And then, she was at the window. And then she was watching. She stayed there for a moment after he was gone, looking at the space where the truck had been, the same careful attention she gave to things she was trying to fully understand. The crisis arrived on a Friday in December. Warden Consulting had been developing a restructuring model for a logistics firm, the centerpiece of a contract worth $340 million and 18 months of the firm's best work. The final review was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The senior analyst who had been running the model discovered a fault on Friday morning. Not a small fault. A foundational error in the demand projection algorithm, a recursive loop in the third-tier forecasting function that had been compounding silently for 6 weeks, distorting outputs in a way subtle enough to pass initial review, but catastrophic in implementation. The analytics team worked through Friday afternoon and into the evening. By 7 o'clock, they had found the origin of the error but could not reconstruct the model in time without corrupting the downstream projections. The lead analyst, a man named David who had 15 years of experience and was currently the color of old paper, told Evelyn he needed until Monday. Evelyn told him he had the weekend and that she would match his hours. It was nearly 8 when Christopher appeared in the corridor on his way to address an HVAC fault on 39. He slowed, stopped. He stood at the glass partition that separated the corridor from the analytics floor, looking at the projection on the main screen, the model architecture, the fault indicators, the cascading red flags down the third-tier column. He stood there long enough for it to matter. Evelyn saw him later, through the partition, when she came out for water. He was already gone. She could not say why she noted the precise duration of his pause, only that she did. She found him in the service corridor, replacing a filtration component with the focused quietness that characterized everything he did. "You saw the model," she said. "He kept working. I saw a screen. You stopped. You looked at it for almost 2 minutes." She had checked the corridor camera. "Do you understand what you were looking at?" A pause. "Yes. You had a recursive loop in your projection layer," Christopher said, without looking up. "Third tier. Probably around week 5 or 6. The compounding error would have been under 0.5% until week 8. Which is why it passed the early reviews. After that, it becomes geometric. By the time you're implementing, you're looking at projections that are 20 to 25% off baseline on the volume side, maybe more on the cost curve." Evelyn was very still. "How do you know what a recursive loop in a demand model looks like?" He set down the component, looked at her. "Because I built demand models for 6 years before I fixed electrical panels. There was a silence between them, not the neutral silence of strangers, but the particular silence of a recalibration. You don't listen to people you think don't belong," he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was the same register as everything else, he said, plain, complete, without theater, but it landed the way plain things do when they are also true. Evelyn opened her mouth and then closed it, because the truth was that if someone had told her, on the night of the storm, that the maintenance technician on the 38th floor had 6 years of experience in algorithmic forecasting, she would have filed the information and continued thinking of him as the maintenance technician. The categories had already been established. The architecture was already in place. She thought about a 9-year-old girl in a hallway, having already decided. "Show me the architecture," she said. They worked until 2 in the morning. Christopher sat at David's workstation with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he moved through the model with the quiet confidence of someone returning to a language they have not spoken in some time but have never forgotten. He identified not only the recursive loop, but 2 smaller structural assumptions in the baseline data that, while not errors themselves, had been amplifying the loop's distortion. He explained each finding in plain, complete sentences, without performance, without the particular display that people sometimes use to demonstrate how much they know. He was simply working, in the way he always worked. And the quality of the work was its own argument. When David arrived at 9 on Saturday morning and found a revised model architecture with full annotation on his workstation, and a handwritten note from Evelyn explaining what had been done and by whom, he sat down heavily in his chair and read through it twice. The annotation was thorough, in the way that only someone with genuine domain knowledge could manage, not just identifying what was wrong, but explaining why the design decision had seemed sound and at what systemic level it had failed. David had been doing this kind of work for 15 years, and he recognized, reading it, that the person who had written it was significantly better at this particular problem than he was. "Who is this person?" he asked. "Someone who was here," Evelyn said. She did not elaborate. She found she didn't need to. Christopher was not there on Saturday. He had left at 1:45, because Lily woke up at 6 regardless of what time he had gone to sleep, and the gap between those 2 facts was simply the life he had built and intended to keep. He did not want acknowledgement in the Monday, all hands. When Evelyn told him the project had been saved, standing in the service corridor on a Tuesday morning, he said, "Good," and meant it, and went back to the panel that had been on the maintenance schedule since October. She stood in the corridor for a moment after he turned away. The fluorescent light above them was slightly cooler than the rest of the floor, something about the ballast he had mentioned, and it made the space feel cleaner, somehow. More honest than the warmer light everywhere else. "You could come back," she said, "to this kind of work. If you wanted to." "I'm fine," he said. Not defensively. Not with the finality that closes conversations. Just as a fact, offered without need for revision. "I have what I need." She drove to his neighborhood on a Saturday in late December, without having entirely decided to do it. She had his address from the maintenance contract, which she told herself was the only reason she knew where he lived, which was not entirely true. It was a residential street in a part of the city that was modest without being diminished, small houses with good trees, the kind of neighborhood where people still shoveled their neighbors' driveways. His house was a gray Craftsman with a covered porch and a bird feeder that had been recently filled, because there were 3 birds in it when she pulled up. She didn't get out of the car immediately. She sat and watched. He came out of the front door at 5:15. He was carrying a grocery bag. Lily ran out behind him and took one of the bags with a seriousness of purpose that was clearly intended to convey that she was helping in a material way. They went inside. Through the front window she could see the kitchen light come on, and then the shapes of them moving behind the glass, his head, her smaller one at hip height, both turning toward something she couldn't see. Evelyn sat in her car in the early winter dark for a long moment. She had spent the last several years building a life that was precise and self-sufficient and extraordinarily defended. She had constructed it deliberately, each element chosen for its reliability, and it had worked, in the sense that it functioned. But watching Christopher come through his front door with his daughter running to meet him, she felt the particular loneliness of someone who has confused protection with living. She had been so certain that staying was something other people did or failed to do something external, being a variable you could not control, and therefore should not depend on, that she had never considered the possibility that the variable was, in part, her own design. Stay was not a statement. It was not a declaration or a promise, or a single decisive act. It was simply this, the daily accumulation of small returns, the specific person, the specific door, the specific child waiting. Not the grand gesture, not the announcement, just the 4:15 departure, every day, without fail, for reasons that had nothing to do with being watched or rewarded, and everything to do with who was on the other side of the door. She knocked at 5:30. He answered it in a faded gray shirt and looked at her with neither surprise nor its performance. Just the look of a man noting a new fact and considering it. "I need to tell you something," Evelyn said. "Okay. I think I've spent a long time misreading things." She said it the way she said difficult things at work precisely, without preamble. "I decided very early that people leave, and then I arranged my life so that they would, because at least then the leaving was something I'd already accounted for. I didn't understand that staying could be quiet. I was looking for it in the wrong register." He listened. He didn't rush to fill the silence after she finished. "I don't know what I'm asking for," she said. "I'm not asking for anything. You said something in the rain that I've been thinking about for 6 weeks, and I thought I owed you the truth of what it did." Inside the house, Lily called something she couldn't make out. Christopher turned his head slightly, the automatic attention of a person who monitors without needing to perform it, and then back to Evelyn. "Do you want to come in?" he said. It was such an ordinary question, the most ordinary question in the world. She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was held. "Yes," she said. The weeks that followed were unremarkable in the way that genuinely good things often are. Evelyn began leaving the office at 7 instead of 9. Not every day, some days the work required what it required, but as a conscious and deliberate practice rather than an exception she was making. She stopped treating her own hunger as an inconvenience. She called a number she had not dialed in 4 years, a number that forwarded to her father's new phone, which she knew because she had checked, which meant that some part of her had been tracking the possibility of this call for longer than she had admitted. He answered on the third ring. He sounded older. She said his name. He said hers. There was a long silence, and she did not fill it with armor. She did not know what they would build from that phone call. She was learning, slowly and without grace, to be comfortable with not knowing. She began stopping by the Craftsman House on Saturdays. Not every Saturday, but with the irregular regularity that begins to form its own pattern without anyone having decided to make it one. Lily had determined, after the second visit, that Evelyn needed to understand the proper method of making grilled cheese, a subject she approached with an authority that left little room for counterargument. Evelyn found herself in possession of opinions about bread-to-cheese ratios she had not previously held, and she shared them with a gravity that Lily found entirely appropriate. There was a Saturday in early January when the power went out on the block for an hour, and Lily had insisted they play a card game by candlelight, and Evelyn had sat across the kitchen table from a 6-year-old who cheated openly and denied it with absolute confidence, and she had laughed a real laugh. The kind that arrived without her having organized or permitted it. And Christopher, from across the table, had looked at her in a way that she felt in her sternum. She did not name it to herself. Not then. Christopher watched this from across the kitchen with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, and said very little. And that was sufficient. One evening in January, after dinner, while Lily was asleep and the house had gone to its particular night quiet, Evelyn sat on the covered porch with a mug of tea, while Christopher leaned against the railing, watching the street. There was no urgency to the moment. No task being accomplished, just the cold and the quiet and the ordinary texture of a neighborhood settling into its evening. She turned to look at him. The streetlight caught the side of his face, the same stillness that had disarmed her on the night of the storm. She thought about all the versions of herself that had been sitting in this exact moment for years, in all the different guises of careful distance she had constructed, waiting for it to fail. "Do you ever stay," she said, "for someone like me?" He didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the street, at a neighbor's dog trotting along the sidewalk, at the ordinary texture of a neighborhood at rest, and then, without announcement, without the weight of a decision being made, he sat down beside her on the porch, close enough that the warmth of his shoulder was something she could sense without contact. He didn't speak. He stayed. That was the answer. That had always been the answer. Not a declaration, not a certainty, not a promise reviewed and signed, just the quiet, unhurried choosing of a proximity. The specific person, the specific porch, the specific evening, one more small return in what was beginning, without either of them announcing it, to feel like a habit worth keeping. Neither of them needed to name it yet. What mattered was that she was not arranging for it to fail. What mattered was that she was still there, on the porch, in the cold, not leaving. And so was he. The street light held them both. The night was very still,